Mufasa, the Lion King arrives with the heavy responsibility of carrying one of the most beloved legacies in animated cinema history, and surprisingly, it does not try to imitate greatness blindly. Instead, the film chooses a more emotional, reflective, and character-driven path that transforms what could have been a simple nostalgic prequel into a layered story about survival, destiny, loneliness, brotherhood, and the painful evolution of power. From the very first frame, the movie establishes a tone that feels grand yet intimate at the same time. The African landscapes stretch endlessly across the screen with breathtaking realism, while the atmosphere carries a quiet emotional sadness underneath the beauty. This is not simply a movie about how Mufasa became king. It is a story about how pain, struggle, love, and betrayal shape someone into a legend. The film opens with an emotional storytelling approach that immediately separates it from many modern animated blockbusters. Rather than throwing the audience directly into action or spectacle, it spends time building emotional investment. We meet Mufasa not as the confident ruler audiences remember, but as a vulnerable cub trying to survive in a world that constantly reminds him he does not belong. That decision becomes the emotional foundation of the entire film. By showing him as small, uncertain, and emotionally isolated, the movie allows viewers to connect with him on a deeply human level. His fears feel real. His confusion feels genuine. His longing for family and identity becomes the emotional heartbeat of the narrative. One of the strongest achievements of the film is how it explores the idea that greatness is not inherited through blood but earned through character. Mufasa is not born into privilege or power. He does not begin as someone special in the eyes of the world. In many ways, he is simply trying to survive each day while searching for meaning and belonging. The screenplay continuously reinforces this theme through his choices. Every challenge he faces slowly shapes his leadership qualities long before he ever sits on a throne. His compassion, courage, and willingness to protect others become more important than strength or status. That emotional progression makes his eventual rise feel earned instead of predetermined. Visually, the movie is astonishing. The photorealistic animation creates an experience that often feels closer to a nature documentary than traditional animation, yet somehow the emotional expressiveness remains intact. Every environment is filled with extraordinary detail. The movement of grass during the windstorms, the reflections in rivers during sunset, the texture of fur during close-up emotional scenes, and the scale of the Pride Lands all contribute to a cinematic world that feels alive. The film frequently pauses to allow the audience to absorb the beauty of its environments, and those moments never feel unnecessary because they strengthen the emotional atmosphere. Nature itself becomes part of the storytelling. The lighting deserves particular praise because it quietly communicates emotion throughout the movie. Warm golden tones dominate moments of hope and connection, while colder shadows appear during scenes of emotional distance or internal conflict. Some of the nighttime sequences are visually mesmerizing, especially when the stars illuminate the landscape in complete silence. These scenes are not just visually beautiful, they carry emotional symbolism about destiny, guidance, and loneliness. The film constantly uses visual language to support its emotional themes rather than relying entirely on dialogue. The relationship between Mufasa and Taka becomes the true center of the story. Their bond initially feels sincere, innocent, and emotionally touching. They are not presented as rivals in the beginning. Instead, they genuinely care for one another, which makes the eventual emotional fracture far more painful. The movie wisely chooses to spend considerable time developing their friendship before introducing deeper conflict. This slow build is essential because it transforms the story from a simple hero versus villain narrative into a tragic emotional collapse between two brothers whose love gradually becomes poisoned by insecurity and jealousy. Taka is arguably the most psychologically complex character in the film. His emotional transformation is handled with surprising maturity. The movie does not portray him as evil from the beginning. Instead, it carefully shows how emotional neglect, insecurity, fear of inadequacy, and wounded pride slowly reshape his personality. Viewers can understand his pain even when they disagree with his actions. That complexity makes him more tragic than monstrous. In many ways, the film becomes an exploration of how resentment grows when someone feels overshadowed by another person's natural strength and emotional connection with others. What makes this dynamic especially powerful is that Mufasa himself never intentionally tries to outshine Taka. In fact, many scenes show genuine affection and loyalty between them. However, destiny slowly begins favoring Mufasa in ways that intensify Taka's internal conflict. The more Mufasa earns admiration naturally through kindness and bravery, the more Taka feels emotionally displaced. The screenplay handles these emotional shifts with patience rather than exaggeration. Small moments of silence, hesitation, disappointment, and emotional distance gradually build into something tragic. This subtle storytelling approach gives the film emotional intelligence rarely seen in family-oriented blockbusters. The voice performances contribute enormously to the emotional impact of the film. The actors do not simply read dialogue, they communicate emotional vulnerability through tone, pauses, and subtle delivery choices. Mufasa's voice evolves throughout the story. Early scenes carry uncertainty and innocence, while later moments reveal growing confidence and wisdom. Taka's performance is equally impressive because it balances affection, insecurity, bitterness, and emotional desperation without becoming melodramatic. Even secondary characters contribute emotional texture to the world, making interactions feel believable rather than purely functional. The musical score quietly elevates nearly every major scene. Instead of overpowering the storytelling, the music supports emotional momentum with elegance. Orchestral arrangements blend beautifully with African-inspired rhythms and vocals, creating a soundscape that feels both nostalgic and fresh. Certain themes carry emotional echoes of the original Lion King universe, which creates an immediate emotional connection for longtime fans. However, the score also establishes its own identity rather than relying entirely on nostalgia. During emotional scenes, the music often becomes minimal and restrained, allowing silence and atmosphere to carry emotional weight. During larger cinematic moments, the score expands dramatically, giving the story an epic sense of scale. One of the most interesting aspects of the movie is its emotional maturity. Although it remains accessible to younger audiences, many of its themes resonate more deeply with adults. The story explores loneliness, identity, emotional rejection, jealousy, grief, and responsibility with surprising sincerity. The emotional conflicts feel grounded rather than exaggerated for entertainment. This maturity allows the movie to function on multiple levels. Children may see an adventure story about animals and survival, while older viewers may recognize a deeper meditation on leadership, emotional wounds, and the psychological consequences of feeling unseen or unloved. The pacing of the film may divide audiences because it prioritizes emotional development over constant action. Some viewers expecting non-stop spectacle may find certain sections slower than anticipated. However, this deliberate pacing is actually one of the film's greatest strengths because it gives emotional moments room to breathe. Relationships are allowed to develop naturally. Conversations carry emotional significance. Character decisions feel motivated rather than rushed. The movie understands that emotional investment matters more than constant movement. By the time major conflicts emerge, the audience already cares deeply about the characters involved. Action scenes, while not overly frequent, are staged with tremendous cinematic intensity. The scale of the environments makes every chase and confrontation feel massive. Natural disasters, predator attacks, and survival sequences are visually thrilling, but they always remain emotionally connected to the characters rather than existing purely for spectacle. Danger feels real because the audience understands what the characters stand to lose emotionally. The movie consistently remembers that emotional stakes matter more than visual destruction. Another major strength is the film's handling of leadership. Mufasa's journey toward becoming a king is not portrayed as a rise toward power but as a gradual understanding of responsibility. The story repeatedly emphasizes that leadership is defined by sacrifice, compassion, and emotional strength rather than dominance. Mufasa earns respect not because he demands it but because he protects others even when it costs him personally. This portrayal of leadership feels refreshingly sincere in a cinematic landscape often dominated by power fantasies. The movie argues that true greatness comes from empathy and courage rather than superiority. The screenplay also deserves credit for avoiding excessive humor. While lighter moments exist, the movie does not constantly interrupt emotional scenes with jokes. This restraint allows dramatic moments to maintain their impact. Silence becomes an important storytelling tool throughout the film. Some of the strongest scenes contain very little dialogue because the animation, music, and atmosphere communicate emotion more effectively than words could. The filmmakers clearly trust the audience's emotional intelligence. There is also a recurring theme about identity and belonging that runs throughout the entire narrative. Mufasa spends much of the film trying to understand where he belongs in the world. That emotional search gives the story universal relatability because many viewers understand the feeling of wanting acceptance, purpose, or connection. The film suggests that family is not simply defined by blood but by loyalty, love, and shared struggle. This idea becomes increasingly important as relationships become more complicated and emotionally fragile. The cinematography often feels surprisingly artistic for a mainstream animated film. Many scenes are framed with painterly precision. Characters appear small against enormous landscapes, emphasizing themes of vulnerability and destiny. Reflections, shadows, firelight, storms, and celestial imagery are repeatedly used to create emotional symbolism. The filmmakers clearly approached the movie with a cinematic ambition beyond simple entertainment. Several sequences feel almost mythological in tone, reinforcing the idea that Mufasa's story is becoming a legend in real time. What ultimately makes Mufasa, the Lion King, emotionally powerful is its sincerity. The film genuinely cares about its characters and their emotional journeys. It does not rely solely on nostalgia, references, or visual spectacle to maintain audience interest. Instead, it invests deeply in emotional storytelling. By the end of the movie, viewers are left not only remembering the stunning visuals but also reflecting on the emotional tragedy of broken brotherhood, the burden of leadership, and the painful cost of destiny. The film succeeds because it understands that the legacy of Mufasa was never about physical strength alone. It was always about emotional wisdom, kindness, courage, and sacrifice. By exploring how those qualities were forged through hardship and emotional pain, the movie transforms a legendary character into someone deeply human and relatable. The result is a cinematic experience that feels emotionally rich, visually breathtaking, and surprisingly thoughtful. Rather than simply revisiting a beloved world, the film expands it emotionally and philosophically, giving audiences a story that feels both familiar and completely new at the same time. As the story progresses beyond its foundational emotional setup, the film begins to shift from a survival narrative into something far more tragic and psychologically complex. Mufasa's journey is no longer just about finding a place in the world, it becomes about understanding the cost of leadership, the fragility of trust, and the painful realization that not every bond is meant to survive the pressure of destiny. The tone gradually darkens, not in a traditional villain-heavy way, but in a deeply emotional sense where relationships begin to fracture under unspoken tension. One of the most compelling aspects of this phase of the film is how naturally the conflict develops. There is no sudden switch where characters become enemies overnight. Instead, the movie carefully constructs emotional distance through small, almost invisible changes. A hesitation in conversation, a missed moment of support, a look of disappointment that lingers a second too long. These subtle storytelling choices accumulate over time until they become irreversible emotional damage. The screenplay is patient, and that patience makes the eventual breakdown feel heartbreaking rather than dramatic for the sake of spectacle. Mufasa's growth during this period becomes more visible as he is forced to take responsibility in increasingly difficult situations. Every challenge tests not only his physical strength but also his emotional stability. he is repeatedly placed in positions where he must choose between personal safety and protecting others. What makes his character compelling is that he rarely chooses himself. Even when fear is present, he consistently prioritizes compassion and responsibility. This repeated pattern slowly shapes him into a natural leader, not through ambition but through action. However, this same growth becomes the emotional trigger for the central conflict. As Mufasa rises in confidence and respect among others, Taka's internal struggle intensifies. The film does not portray Taka's transformation as simple jealousy. Instead, it carefully builds a psychological portrait of a character who feels invisible despite being emotionally invested in everything around him. His pain is not loud, it is quiet, internal, and deeply human. He begins to interpret every success of Mufasa not as inspiration, but as personal failure. This emotional distortion becomes the foundation of his eventual downfall. What makes Taka's arc particularly powerful is that the audience is never encouraged to fully hate him. Even when his decisions become increasingly destructive, there remains a lingering understanding of his emotional wound. The film subtly suggests that he was never truly given the emotional validation he needed. His insecurity grows in silence, and that silence becomes more dangerous than any external threat. In this sense, the movie presents a tragic idea, that emotional neglect can be as destructive as physical conflict. The relationship between the two characters reaches a turning point through a series of events that feel both inevitable and painful. The bond that once felt unbreakable begins to collapse not through one dramatic betrayal, but through a chain of emotional misunderstandings and unresolved feelings. The screenplay avoids oversimplification. There is no clear good vs evil framing. Instead, it presents two individuals shaped by different emotional experiences slowly drifting apart in a world that does not give them space to heal. Visually, the film continues to maintain its extraordinary standard in Part 2. However, the visuals now take on a more symbolic role. The environment increasingly reflects the emotional state of the characters. Storms appear during moments of conflict, vast empty landscapes reflect emotional isolation, and darker color palettes begin to dominate key turning points in the story. The cinematography subtly mirrors the psychological descent happening within the characters, making the world itself feel emotionally reactive. The musical score becomes even more important in this section of the film. Where dialogue becomes sparse or emotionally restrained, the music carries the weight of storytelling. Soft, melancholic themes accompany moments of reflection, while deeper, more dramatic compositions highlight emotional collapse. The score never feels manipulative, instead, it feels like an extension of the characters' internal emotional worlds. In many scenes, silence and music blend together in a way that allows the audience to feel rather than simply observe. One of the strongest thematic developments in this part of the film is the exploration of identity versus perception. Mufasa is increasingly seen by others as a leader, even before he fully accepts that identity himself. This external perception begins to shape his internal understanding of who he is. At the same time, Taka is increasingly defined by how others fail to see his worth. This contrast creates a painful emotional imbalance between them. One is being lifted by recognition, while the other is slowly being crushed by invisibility. This emotional imbalance is where the tragedy of the story deepens. The film does not suggest that either character is inherently wrong. Instead, it shows how emotional needs, when unmet or misunderstood, can distort relationships over time. Mufasa's kindness, which is his greatest strength, becomes unintentionally painful for Taka because it highlights everything Taka feels he lacks. The movie handles this contradiction with remarkable sensitivity, never reducing either character to a stereotype. As tensions rise, the sense of inevitability becomes stronger. The audience begins to understand that the emotional gap between the two characters is no longer reparable. Yet the film continues to hold onto moments of hope, small gestures of brotherhood, brief reminders of shared history, and emotional flashbacks that emphasize what once existed between them. These moments are what make the eventual separation emotionally devastating rather than simply dramatic. The action sequences in this portion of the film serve a more emotional purpose than before. They are no longer just survival challenges but turning points that force characters into irreversible decisions. Each confrontation feels like it pushes the relationship one step closer to collapse. The choreography of these scenes is grounded and realistic, focusing on consequence rather than spectacle. The danger feels personal because it is directly tied to emotional stakes. Leadership continues to be a central theme, but it becomes more complicated in this section. Mufasa begins to understand that leadership is not just about doing the right thing, but also about accepting that not everyone will understand or support your decisions. This realization adds emotional weight to his character. He is not simply becoming stronger, he is becoming more isolated in his responsibility. The burden of leadership starts to separate him emotionally from those around him, even those he cares about deeply. Taka's psychological decline is portrayed with increasing subtlety. Rather than turning him into a traditional antagonist, the film emphasizes his emotional fragmentation. He begins to make decisions based not on logic but on emotional pain. His actions are shaped by a need to reclaim control over a life he feels slipping away. The tragedy here is that his desire for recognition slowly transforms into destructive behavior, not because he lacks love, but because he cannot process emotional rejection in a healthy way. The screenplay continues to avoid simplistic moral judgments. Instead, it presents a world where emotional consequences matter more than clear definitions of right and wrong. This makes the story feel more realistic and grounded, even within its animated and mythic setting. The emotional complexity elevates the narrative beyond typical family adventure storytelling. By the end of this section, the emotional tone of the film has shifted significantly. What began as a story of survival and friendship now feels like a slow emotional unraveling of two deeply connected lives. The audience is left in a state of tension, knowing that the bond between Mufasa and Taka is approaching a breaking point that cannot be avoided. And yet, even in this emotional darkness, the film continues to hold onto its central message, that identity is shaped not only by what we achieve, but by how we respond to pain, loss, and responsibility. Mufasa continues to grow into a figure defined by compassion and sacrifice, while Taka becomes increasingly defined by emotional wounds that he cannot express or heal. The result is a story that feels less like a traditional origin tale and more like a tragedy written in emotional layers. Every choice matters. Every silence matters. Every moment of misunderstanding carries weight. The film succeeds in creating a sense of emotional realism that lingers long after the scenes end. As the film moves toward its final act, the emotional tension that has been building throughout the story finally reaches its breaking point. The relationship between Mufasa and Taka, which once symbolized trust, brotherhood, and shared survival, now stands at the edge of irreversible collapse. The final portion of the film is not just about external events or physical confrontations, but about the emotional consequences of every decision made so far. The story stops feeling like a journey and starts feeling like a tragedy that was always meant to happen. What makes the ending so powerful is that it does not rely on sudden twists or exaggerated villainy. Instead, it feels inevitable. Every emotional fracture that was subtly built in earlier parts finally comes together to form a complete breakdown. The audience is no longer surprised by the conflict, they are emotionally prepared for it, and that preparation makes it even more painful. The film carefully avoids glorifying betrayal or simplifying it into a single moment. Instead, it presents it as the result of long-term emotional imbalance, miscommunication, and internal suffering that was never properly addressed. Mufasa's character reaches his full transformation in this final section. He is no longer the uncertain cub from the beginning, nor just a growing leader learning responsibility. He has become someone who carries emotional weight with quiet strength. His leadership is now defined by acceptance rather than ambition. He understands that being a king is not about being admired, but about making difficult choices even when they lead to personal loss. This maturity gives his character a sense of emotional depth that feels earned through everything he has endured. At the same time, Taka's emotional journey reaches its most tragic point. By this stage, he is no longer acting out of confusion or insecurity alone, he is fully consumed by emotional pain that has transformed into bitterness. However, the film never completely removes his humanity. Even in his darkest moments, there are glimpses of the character he once was: the brother, the friend, the protector. These brief emotional reflections make his arc even more heartbreaking because they remind the audience that he was never inherently evil, only deeply wounded. The final confrontation between the two characters is structured more like an emotional collapse than a traditional battle. It is not just about physical conflict but about everything that has been left unsaid between them. Words that were never spoken, feelings that were never understood, and trust that was slowly eroded all come crashing together in a moment that feels both cinematic and deeply personal. The film uses silence, pauses, and visual framing to emphasize emotional weight rather than relying solely on dialogue. One of the most striking aspects of the final act is how the environment reflects the emotional state of the story. The once vibrant and open landscapes of the Pride Lands begin to feel harsher and more isolating. Storms, shadows, and vast empty spaces dominate the screen, symbolizing the emotional distance that now exists between the characters. Nature, which earlier felt alive and nurturing, now feels indifferent to their struggle. This shift reinforces the idea that emotional consequences shape not only individuals but the world around them. The musical score reaches its emotional peak in this section. Instead of overwhelming the scenes, it carefully supports them with restrained intensity. Soft themes of sadness and loss gradually build into more powerful orchestral moments as the story approaches its conclusion. The music never tells the audience how to feel, it simply amplifies what is already present in the performances and visuals. In many moments, silence becomes just as important as sound, allowing emotional impact to settle naturally. As the climax unfolds, the film emphasizes one of its core messages, that destiny is not a fixed path, but something shaped by choices, pain, and responsibility. Mufasa's rise is not portrayed as a simple fulfillment of fate, but as the result of countless difficult decisions made in moments of uncertainty. His strength is not just physical or political, it is emotional endurance. He survives not because life is easy for him, but because he continues to choose compassion even when it costs him deeply. Taka's downfall, on the other hand, is not treated as destiny in a supernatural sense, but as the consequence of unresolved emotional wounds. The film presents his transformation as a warning about what happens when pain is left unspoken and unhealed. His character arc becomes a tragic mirror to Mufasa's journey. Where one chooses empathy, the other succumbs to emotional isolation. Where one finds meaning through connection, the other loses himself through separation. The ending carries a strong sense of emotional weight rather than conventional resolution. It does not attempt to undo the tragedy or simplify its consequences. Instead, it accepts them as part of the story's emotional truth. The audience is left with a feeling of loss, but also understanding. The film suggests that not all relationships are meant to survive, even when love once existed. Some bonds are shaped by circumstances that eventually pull people in different directions. One of the most meaningful elements of the conclusion is how it redefines Mufasa's legacy. By the end of the film, he is no longer just a character who will become a king in the future. He is a symbol of emotional strength, sacrifice, and moral clarity. His journey gives weight to his eventual role in the larger Lion King mythology. The audience now understands not just what he became, but what he had to endure to become it. The film's emotional final moments are quiet rather than explosive. Instead of relying on large dramatic spectacle, it chooses reflection. The stillness of the ending allows the audience to absorb the emotional journey in full. It is in these quiet moments that the true impact of the film is felt. The absence of resolution in certain emotional aspects makes the story feel more realistic and human. From a thematic perspective, the movie ultimately revolves around three central ideas: identity, emotional consequence, and leadership. Identity is shaped not by origin, but by experience. Emotional consequences define the trajectory of relationships. Leadership is not power, but responsibility carried through suffering and sacrifice. These themes are woven consistently throughout all three parts of the film, giving it a unified emotional structure. Visually, the film maintains its cinematic excellence until the very end. The contrast between light and shadow, the use of vast natural landscapes, and the careful framing of characters against their environment all contribute to a sense of mythic storytelling. Every visual element feels intentional, reinforcing the emotional tone of the narrative rather than simply serving as decoration. By the time the credits begin to roll, the audience is left with a mixture of emotions: sadness, admiration, reflection, and understanding. The story does not end with complete emotional comfort, and that is precisely what makes it powerful. It lingers in the mind because it does not offer simple answers to complex emotional experiences. In conclusion, Mufasa, The Lion King succeeds not just as a prequel, but as an emotional origin story that deepens the mythology of one of cinema's most iconic characters. It transforms Mufasa from a symbol of leadership into a deeply human figure shaped by pain, love, and sacrifice. At the same time, it presents Taka as a tragic reminder of how emotional neglect and insecurity can reshape even the strongest bonds. The film's greatest achievement is its emotional honesty. It does not shy away from sadness, complexity, or moral ambiguity. Instead, it embraces them fully, creating a story that feels both epic and intimate. It is a film about kings and kingdoms, but even more so, it is a film about hearts, choices, and the invisible emotional forces that shape destiny. Ultimately, the movie leaves behind a lasting message: greatness is not defined by where you come from, but by how you carry what you have been through. And in that sense, Mufasa's journey becomes not just a story of becoming a king, but a story of becoming oneself through struggle, loss, and unwavering compassion. After the emotional climax and collapse of trust shown earlier, the film's deeper meaning starts to reveal itself more clearly. At its core, this story is not just about Mufasa becoming a king, and it is not even just about brotherhood turning into tragedy. It is about how identity is formed through pain, and how emotional experiences silently build the foundation of who someone eventually becomes. Mufasa's character represents earned identity. He does not arrive in the world with status, recognition, or protection. Everything he becomes is shaped through experience. The film repeatedly shows him being tested in situations where there is no easy outcome. What defines him is not strength alone, but his repeated decision to protect others even when it costs him personally. This is a key psychological trait: altruism under pressure. In real human psychology, this is often what separates leaders from followers: not intelligence or power, but emotional resilience combined with empathy. On the opposite side, Taka represents something much more fragile and realistic: identity built on comparison. His emotional world is shaped not by what he is, but by what he is not. Every moment of Mufasa's success becomes a reminder of his own perceived failure. This creates a dangerous psychological loop where admiration slowly turns into resentment. The film subtly explores how this kind of mindset does not require evil intentions; it develops naturally when emotional validation is missing. This is where the film becomes more than a simple origin story. It becomes a study of emotional inequality between two individuals who started equally close. At the beginning, both characters share the same environment, the same struggles, and the same bond. But as life progresses, their emotional interpretations of events begin to diverge. One internalizes struggle as growth, while the other internalizes it as rejection. This difference becomes the foundation of everything that follows. The symbolism in the film strengthens these psychological ideas. Light and darkness are used not just visually, but emotionally. Mufasa is often framed in open spaces with natural light, symbolizing emotional clarity and acceptance. Taka, on the other hand, is frequently shown in tighter frames, shadows, or partially obstructed visuals, reflecting emotional confinement and confusion. These are not just aesthetic choices, they reflect internal mental states. Another important symbolic element is movement versus stillness. Mufasa is constantly moving forward, both physically and emotionally. Even when he is unsure, he continues progressing. Taka often appears emotionally stuck, replaying situations internally, unable to release past emotions. This contrast becomes a visual metaphor for emotional processing. One character adapts, while the other accumulates unresolved pain. The film also subtly explores the concept of earned belonging versus assumed belonging. Mufasa earns his place in the world through actions and relationships. He builds trust slowly and consistently. Taka, however, believes belonging should already be guaranteed because of his emotional expectations. When reality does not match that expectation, it creates frustration and emotional collapse. This is a very human psychological conflict that many people experience in different forms, especially in families, friendships, and sibling relationships. Another major theme that becomes clearer in this part is emotional communication failure. At multiple points, the tragedy could theoretically be prevented if characters openly expressed their feelings. But the film realistically shows how emotional discomfort often leads to silence instead of communication. Mufasa, focused on responsibility, does not always recognize the emotional needs of others around him. Taka, overwhelmed by insecurity, is unable to express vulnerability in a healthy way. This mutual silence becomes one of the strongest causes of their emotional separation. From a narrative structure perspective, the film is deliberately built like a slow emotional descent rather than a traditional three-act action story. Each act reduces emotional stability further, tightening the psychological pressure on the characters. Instead of external villains driving the conflict, internal emotional states become the true antagonistic force. In that sense, the story is less about good versus evil and more about healing versus unhealed pain. Even the idea of destiny is reinterpreted in this section. The film does not treat destiny as something magical or predetermined. Instead, it presents destiny as something shaped through repeated emotional decisions. Mufasa's future greatness is not framed as fate, it is framed as consequence. Every compassionate action becomes a building block toward leadership. Every moment of endurance becomes preparation for responsibility. Taka's path is framed similarly, but in reverse. His downfall is not sudden or random. It is the accumulation of unresolved emotional experiences. The film quietly suggests that if emotional pain is not processed, it does not disappear, it transforms. And in Taka's case, it transforms into resentment, isolation, and ultimately destructive decision-making. One of the most powerful emotional ideas in this part is that both characters are actually shaped by love but in different forms. Mufasa's love is outward-facing, expressed through protection and sacrifice. Taka's love is internalized, tied to expectation, recognition, and emotional reassurance. When those expectations are not met, love does not disappear, it becomes painful. This is what makes the story emotionally complex rather than simplistic. Even supporting elements in the film reinforce these ideas. The environment itself often behaves like a reflection of emotional tone. Calm, open plains appear during moments of connection, while harsh weather or isolated terrain appears during emotional separation. This creates a subconscious connection between nature and emotional reality, reinforcing the idea that the world itself is responding to internal human conflict. The pacing in this part becomes intentionally slower and more reflective. The film allows silence, pauses, and nonverbal moments to carry emotional weight. This is important because it mirrors real emotional processing. In real life, major emotional shifts are rarely loud, they are quiet, gradual, and often internal. By the end of this section, the viewer begins to fully understand that the story is not heading toward a simple resolution. Instead, it is moving toward emotional inevitability. The bond between Mufasa and Taka is no longer just strained, it is structurally broken. And what remains is not uncertainty about if something will collapse, but how deeply it will affect both characters when it does. As the story reaches its final stretch, the emotional weight that has been building since the beginning finally becomes unavoidable. The film no longer feels like a journey of discovery, it feels like the final unfolding of consequences that were already set in motion long ago. Every interaction between Mufasa and Taka now carries the heaviness of everything they failed to say to each other earlier. The final act is not built on surprise, but on emotional inevitability. The climax is structured in a way that focuses less on action and more on emotional confrontation. When the final breaking point arrives, it is not just a physical moment of conflict but a psychological collapse of everything the two characters once shared. The film carefully strips away external distractions so that the audience is left only with emotional truth. At its core, this is no longer a battle between two individuals, it is the collapse of a brotherhood that was never given the chance to heal. Mufasa's final emotional state in this section is defined by acceptance. He no longer fights for recognition or validation. Instead, he fully embraces responsibility even when it leads to personal loss. This is the moment where his character completes its transformation. He is not becoming a king because he wants power, he is becoming a king because he understands that leadership often means standing alone when necessary. His strength is no longer physical dominance, but emotional endurance. What makes this transformation powerful is that it does not feel sudden. It feels like the natural result of everything he has endured. Every hardship, every sacrifice, and every moment of compassion has built toward this point. The film subtly reinforces the idea that leadership is not a single decision but a lifetime of emotional conditioning. Mufasa does not become a king in this moment, he simply accepts what he has already been becoming throughout the story. Taka's final emotional descent is equally important, but far more tragic in tone. By this stage, his emotional worldview has completely shifted. He no longer sees Mufasa as a brother or equal, but as a symbol of everything he believes he has lost. However, the film never removes his humanity. Even in his most broken state, there are brief flashes of who he once was, moments of hesitation, emotional conflict, and buried affection that still exist beneath the pain. This duality is what makes the climax emotionally devastating. The audience is forced to recognize that there is no simple villain in this story. Instead, there are two emotionally damaged perspectives colliding at their breaking point. One character chooses responsibility even at great personal cost, while the other becomes consumed by emotional wounds that were never properly addressed. The tragedy is not that one defeats the other, it is that both lose something irreplaceable. The environment during the climax reflects this emotional collapse. The world feels harsher, emptier, and more emotionally detached than before. Nature, which once symbolized life and harmony, now mirrors emotional separation. Wide empty spaces emphasize loneliness, while chaotic natural elements reflect internal turmoil. The film uses this visual language to reinforce the idea that emotional conflict does not exist in isolation, it affects perception of the entire world. The musical score reaches its most restrained and powerful form in this section. Instead of overwhelming the moment, it allows silence to dominate key emotional beats. When music does appear, it is subtle and melancholic, almost like a memory rather than a force. This restraint allows the emotional impact to land naturally. The absence of sound becomes just as meaningful as its presence, emphasizing loss, reflection, and emotional finality. One of the most important thematic conclusions of the film is the idea that identity is not inherited, it is formed through emotional experience. Mufasa does not become great because he was destined to be so. He becomes great because he consistently chooses compassion, even in situations where fear or anger would have been easier. His identity is shaped through repeated emotional decisions, each one reinforcing the person he eventually becomes. Taka's arc reinforces the opposite idea, that unresolved emotional pain can reshape identity in destructive ways. The film does not suggest he was born flawed or evil. Instead, it shows how emotional neglect, insecurity, and comparison can slowly erode a person's sense of self. His transformation is not sudden corruption, it is gradual emotional deterioration. The ending does not offer traditional resolution. Instead, it offers emotional understanding. The audience is not meant to feel complete closure, but reflection. The film leaves certain emotional wounds intentionally open, mirroring real-life relationships where closure is not always possible. Some bonds do not end with clarity, they end with distance, regret, and memory. Mufasa's final position in the story redefines everything the audience thought they knew about him. He is no longer just a legendary king from mythology, he becomes a deeply human figure shaped by struggle, loss, and emotional responsibility. His strength is not perfection, it is endurance. His greatness is not dominance, it is compassion maintained under pressure. Taka's legacy, while tragic, is equally important. His character becomes a representation of what happens when emotional pain is not understood or healed. He is not portrayed as meaningless or disposable, but as a reminder of emotional vulnerability. His downfall is not celebrated, it is mourned. The film ensures that his humanity is never fully erased, even in his final moments. From a broader perspective, the film's message becomes clear in its conclusion: every legend has an emotional cost. Behind every great leader is a history of sacrifice, loneliness, and difficult choices. Behind every broken relationship is a series of small emotional fractures that were never repaired in time. The film does not simplify these truths, it presents them in their full emotional complexity. The final scenes are deliberately quiet, allowing the emotional weight of the story to settle. There is no need for excessive dialogue or dramatic explanation. The silence itself becomes the conclusion. It reflects acceptance, loss, and understanding all at once. The audience is left not with answers, but with emotional resonance. In the end, Mufasa, the Lion King, succeeds as more than just a prequel. It becomes a complete emotional origin story that redefines a legendary character through pain, growth, and moral complexity. It transforms Mufasa from a symbolic king into a fully realized emotional figure, and in doing so, it expands the meaning of his legacy. The film's greatest strength lies in its emotional honesty. It does not avoid sadness, complexity, or uncomfortable truths. Instead, it embraces them fully, creating a narrative that feels both epic in scale and deeply personal in meaning. It is a story about leadership, but more importantly, it is a story about emotional survival. Ultimately, the film leaves behind a lasting reflection: greatness is not about power or destiny, it is about how someone chooses to carry their pain, and whether they transform it into compassion or destruction. In that sense, Mufasa's journey is not just the rise of a king, but the rise of emotional wisdom forged through suffering. After the emotional closure of the main narrative, the film's meaning does not actually end. Instead, it expands outward, forcing the audience to reflect on what they have just witnessed. The story of Mufasa is no longer just a character origin, it becomes a reflection on how legends are created, and what emotional cost is hidden behind them. At its core, Mufasa, the Lion King, redefines what a hero origin story means. Instead of focusing on external victories, the film focuses on internal transformation. Mufasa's journey is not built on defeating enemies in battle alone, but on defeating fear, self-doubt, and emotional instability. This makes the film less about action and more about psychological evolution. One of the most powerful after effects of the story is how it changes the way the audience views the original Lion King mythology. Mufasa is no longer just a wise and powerful king who appears fully formed. After this film, he becomes a symbol of emotional endurance shaped by suffering. This retroactive depth adds emotional weight to his original portrayal, making his legacy feel even more meaningful. The film also presents a subtle but important commentary on how society remembers leaders. In history and storytelling, people often remember kings, leaders, and heroes as finished products. But this movie challenges that idea by showing the unfinished, painful process behind greatness. It suggests that society often sees results but ignores the emotional journey that produces them. In Mufasa's case, the crown is not the beginning of his identity, it is the result of everything he survived before it. Another important layer of meaning lies in the film's treatment of emotional suppression versus emotional expression. Mufasa often internalizes his struggles and continues forward without breaking. While this gives him strength, it also isolates him emotionally. The film quietly raises a question: does true leadership require emotional sacrifice, and if so, at what cost? This is not answered directly, but it lingers beneath every major decision he makes. Taka's legacy, when viewed from this broader perspective, becomes even more significant. He is not just a tragic character within the story, he represents the emotional consequences of being unseen, unheard, and emotionally unsupported. The film subtly critiques environments where emotional validation is unevenly distributed. It shows how easily emotional imbalance can create long-term psychological damage, even between people who care about each other deeply. This duality between Mufasa and Taka forms the emotional core of the entire film. One becomes a symbol of controlled emotional strength, while the other becomes a symbol of emotional collapse caused by internalized pain. Neither is portrayed as fully right or wrong. Instead, the film presents a realistic truth: human emotions are complex, and outcomes are shaped by how those emotions are processed over time. From a cinematic perspective, the film's visual storytelling reinforces this message constantly. The use of scale is particularly important. Mufasa is often shown against vast landscapes, suggesting growth, openness, and emotional expansion. Taka is frequently framed in more restricted or shadowed compositions, suggesting confinement and emotional narrowing. These visual patterns are not accidental, they are psychological storytelling tools. The sound design also plays a long-term emotional role. Even after the film ends, certain musical themes feel like emotional echoes. The score does not just accompany scenes, it embeds emotional memory into the viewer's experience. This is why the film feels reflective even after it is over. The music continues to speak in memory. One of the deeper philosophical ideas in the film is the concept of earned identity versus assigned identity. Mufasa does not accept a role simply because it is given to him or expected of him. Instead, he grows into it through lived experience. The film suggests that true identity is not something granted by birth or title, but something built through consistent emotional choices over time. This idea connects directly to leadership as a broader theme. The movie does not define leadership as authority. It defines leadership as emotional responsibility. A leader, in this narrative, is someone who carries burden without abandoning compassion. This is why Mufasa's journey feels emotionally heavy. It is not about gaining power, but about absorbing responsibility without losing humanity. The film also subtly critiques the idea of emotional competition. The relationship between Mufasa and Taka begins to collapse when comparison replaces connection. Once individuals start measuring their worth against each other instead of supporting each other, emotional distance becomes inevitable. This is one of the most realistic psychological portrayals in the entire story. Another important aspect is the idea of unspoken emotions. A large portion of the tragedy in the film could have been softened if feelings had been communicated earlier. But the characters, like many real people, struggle with vulnerability. This silence becomes a destructive force. The film uses this to highlight a universal truth: emotional avoidance often creates larger consequences than emotional expression. By the time the narrative reaches its final reflective state, the audience is left with a layered emotional experience rather than a simple conclusion. There is sadness, but also understanding. There is loss, but also clarity. The film does not aim to comfort completely, it aims to make the viewer think about emotional relationships in a deeper way. In terms of overall cinematic achievement, the film stands out because it does not treat animation as limitation. Instead, it uses animation to amplify emotional realism. The lifelike visuals make emotional expressions more subtle and impactful. Every glance, pause, and movement carries emotional meaning, often more effectively than dialogue. The final takeaway from Mufasa, The Lion King, is not just about a character becoming a king. It is about how emotional experiences shape identity in irreversible ways. It shows that greatness is not a sudden transformation, it is a long process of endurance, decision-making, and emotional survival. Ultimately, the film leaves the audience with a quiet but powerful realization: every legend has an unseen emotional history. Behind every symbol of strength is a series of moments where that strength was tested, broken, and rebuilt. Mufasa's story is not just about becoming a king, it is about becoming someone who carries pain without letting it destroy compassion. And that is why the film resonates beyond its runtime. It is not just watched, it is felt, reflected upon, and remembered as an emotional journey rather than a simple story. Even after the story of Mufasa settles into its known mythology, the emotional aftershock of Mufasa, The Lion King, continues to expand in the viewer's mind in a way that feels surprisingly personal. The film does not just function as a prequel that explains events, it operates more like an emotional reconstruction of a figure who was once seen only as a symbol. After watching his journey from vulnerability to leadership, Mufasa no longer feels like a distant legendary king. He feels like someone shaped by emotional weight, silent sacrifices, and decisions made under pressure where no outcome was completely right or wrong. This emotional shift is one of the film's most powerful achievements because it changes perception retroactively, making even the smallest memory of the character in the original timeline feel heavier with meaning. What becomes especially interesting at this stage is how the film reflects real human psychology through its characters without explicitly stating it. Mufasa represents emotional regulation under extreme pressure. He is someone who constantly suppresses panic, fear, and self-doubt in order to fulfill responsibility. Psychologically, this reflects a personality type that develops resilience through necessity rather than comfort. His strength is not natural perfection, it is adaptive survival. Every time he chooses calmness over chaos, or compassion over anger, he is essentially training his mind to prioritize stability over emotional reaction. This is why his leadership feels believable, because it is built through repeated emotional conditioning rather than sudden transformation. Taka, in contrast, represents a far more fragile psychological pattern that is equally realistic. His emotional identity is built on comparison, validation, and perceived recognition. When those needs are not met, his internal world becomes unstable. The film carefully shows how such instability does not immediately lead to destruction; instead, it builds slowly through interpretation. Events themselves are not always harmful, but the way he interprets them becomes increasingly distorted. This is a subtle but important psychological truth: emotional suffering is often not caused by reality itself, but by how reality is internally processed. Taka's tragedy is that he begins to see every moment through the lens of inadequacy, and once that lens becomes fixed, even positive events feel like rejection. The emotional distance between Mufasa and Taka therefore becomes less about external conflict and more about internal misalignment. One grows through acceptance of responsibility, while the other becomes trapped in emotional comparison. The film uses this contrast not to assign blame, but to demonstrate how two individuals can experience the same world in completely different emotional ways. This divergence is what ultimately breaks their bond, not a single event or betrayal. It is the slow accumulation of misunderstood emotions, unspoken pain, and unexpressed vulnerability that creates irreversible distance. On a symbolic level, the film continues to operate through nature imagery that mirrors psychological states. Open landscapes reflect emotional clarity and acceptance, while enclosed or shadowed spaces represent internal conflict and emotional restriction. Even changes in weather patterns feel like extensions of character emotion rather than background visuals. This technique strengthens immersion because the environment does not feel separate from the characters, it feels like a reflection of them. The world itself becomes emotionally responsive, reinforcing the idea that internal states shape perception of reality. Another deeper layer of interpretation lies in the concept of legacy. The film quietly questions what it truly means to leave behind a legacy that is remembered positively. Mufasa's legacy is not built only on his actions as a king, but on the emotional path he takes to become one. However, the film also suggests that legacy is always incomplete because it is seen from the outside. People remember outcomes, not emotional struggles. In this sense, the film is almost melancholic. It implies that even the most meaningful emotional journeys are eventually reduced to simplified stories when remembered by others. This idea connects strongly to the film's treatment of memory itself. Much of what defines Mufasa in the broader Lion King mythology is already known before this film begins. Yet the emotional depth added here recontextualizes that memory in a way that cannot be reversed. Once the audience sees his vulnerability, his uncertainty, and his emotional sacrifices, the original perception of him as a flawless symbol of strength becomes impossible to maintain. Instead, he becomes a layered figure whose strength is inseparable from pain. This is what gives the film its emotional permanence. It changes interpretation rather than just adding information. The pacing of emotional realization in this final layer is intentionally slow, almost reflective. The film does not rush to conclude meaning. Instead, it allows emotional understanding to settle gradually. This mirrors real psychological processing, where understanding often comes after reflection rather than during events themselves. The audience is left piecing together emotional logic long after the narrative has technically ended, which is why the film lingers in memory. Even the concept of heroism is subtly redefined through this lens. Traditional storytelling often treats heroes as individuals who rise above others through strength or destiny. However, this film presents heroism as something quieter and more internal. Heroism becomes the ability to remain compassionate despite emotional pressure, to continue making responsible choices even when personal feelings are fractured, and to endure emotional isolation without abandoning moral clarity. Mufasa's heroism is therefore not dramatic. It is consistent, restrained, and emotionally costly. At the same time, the film resists the temptation to simplify Taka into a cautionary figure alone. Instead, it frames him as a reflection of emotional imbalance that can exist in anyone when vulnerability is not processed. This prevents the story from becoming moralistic. There is no simple lesson like good emotions vs bad emotions. Instead, there is an exploration of how unmanaged emotional pain can alter perception and behavior over time. By the end of this interpretive layer, the film transforms into something more than narrative entertainment. It becomes a study of emotional formation, identity construction, and psychological divergence. It asks the viewer to consider how much of who we become is shaped not by events themselves, but by how we internally respond to them. It also asks whether emotional strength is truly about control, or about the ability to continue functioning without losing empathy. Ultimately, Mufasa, the Lion King, leaves behind an emotional structure rather than a simple ending. It does not close its themes, it disperses them into reflection. The story continues inside the viewer because it connects to universal emotional experiences: belonging, comparison, responsibility, and loss. And in doing so, it achieves something rare. It turns a known cinematic legend into a deeply human emotional journey that feels both personal and timeless. At its deepest level, Mufasa, the Lion King, is not really about lions, kingdoms, or even survival in the physical sense. It is about the invisible architecture of emotional experience that builds a personality over time. The film's true subject is not what Mufasa becomes in the external world, but what he becomes internally when life repeatedly forces him to choose between instinct and responsibility, fear and compassion, isolation and connection. This is why the story feels less like a traditional animated prequel and more like an emotional biography of leadership itself. What makes this final philosophical layer so powerful is the realization that the film is structured around emotional consequences rather than narrative events. Every major moment in the story is less important for what happens and more important for what it does to the characters internally. A single decision does not just change the plot, it reshapes identity. Mufasa's growth is therefore not linear, it is accumulative. Each emotional experience adds another layer of understanding, until he is no longer reacting to life but interpreting it through a deeply formed moral and emotional framework. This is where the film quietly shifts from storytelling into reflection. It begins to mirror real human development in a way that feels almost psychological in structure. People are not shaped by one defining moment, but by hundreds of small emotional reactions that gradually build into personality. The film captures this truth by showing how Mufasa consistently processes hardship through acceptance rather than resistance. Even when faced with unfairness, loss, or emotional confusion, he does not allow those experiences to define him negatively. Instead, he absorbs them, learns from them, and transforms them into responsibility. Taka's emotional arc, when viewed through this final philosophical lens, becomes even more tragic because it represents an alternative psychological outcome. Where Mufasa internalizes struggle as growth, Taka internalizes it as rejection. Where Mufasa expands emotionally through experience, Taka contracts emotionally under pressure. This contrast is not just narrative, it is deeply symbolic of how two individuals can experience identical environments but develop completely different emotional realities. The film uses this contrast to suggest that identity is not only shaped by events, but by emotional interpretation of those events. One of the most profound ideas embedded in this part of the film is the concept of emotional inheritance versus emotional construction. Mufasa does not inherit emotional stability, he constructs it through experience. His sense of self is not given, it is built. Every hardship becomes raw material for emotional maturity. In contrast, Taka's emotional identity is heavily dependent on external validation, which makes it unstable. When that validation is inconsistent or absent, his internal structure begins to collapse. This contrast reflects a very real psychological truth: emotional independence is built, not born. The film also suggests that leadership, in its truest form, is not about authority or recognition but about emotional endurance in the face of uncertainty. Mufasa's eventual position is not the result of dominance over others, but the result of his ability to remain grounded when emotionally overwhelmed. He becomes a leader not because he seeks leadership, but because others begin to rely on his emotional stability. This is a subtle but important distinction. The film reframes leadership as something that emerges naturally from emotional maturity rather than ambition. Another important philosophical thread running through this final layer is the idea of unresolved emotional echoes. Even after the story reaches its conclusion, nothing truly feels closed in a traditional sense. Instead, the emotional weight continues to echo beyond the narrative. This is intentional. The film is not trying to provide complete emotional resolution because real emotional experiences rarely end neatly. People carry fragments of relationships, memories, and unresolved feelings throughout their lives. The film reflects this reality by leaving emotional space open rather than sealed. The visual language of the film also reinforces this idea of emotional continuation. Wide, open landscapes suggest that life continues beyond the frame. Characters are often positioned as small figures within vast environments, emphasizing the idea that individual emotional experiences are part of something larger and ongoing. The world does not stop for emotional resolution, and neither does time. This reinforces the idea that the story is a moment within a much larger emotional continuum. At its deepest level, the film becomes a meditation on how pain transforms into identity depending on emotional processing. Pain itself is not portrayed as inherently destructive. Instead, its outcome depends entirely on how it is processed. In Mufasa's case, pain becomes wisdom. In Taka's case, pain becomes distortion. This is one of the most realistic psychological themes in the entire narrative, and it is handled without moral simplification. The film does not say one character is good and the other is bad. It shows that emotional outcomes are shaped by internal coping mechanisms rather than moral categories. By the time this final philosophical interpretation settles, the audience is left with a deeper understanding of what the film truly represents. It is not just an origin story of a king. It is a reflection on how emotional endurance, interpretation of pain, and response to adversity shape identity over time. It suggests that greatness is not a moment of achievement, but a long process of emotional survival and moral consistency under pressure. Ultimately, Mufasa, the Lion King, leaves behind a message that feels both simple and deeply complex at the same time. Every individual is shaped not only by what happens to them, but by how they emotionally carry what happens to them. Some transform pain into purpose, while others are consumed by it. And in between those two paths lies the entire human experience. At this final interpretive stage, the story of Mufasa, the Lion King, stops being just a narrative about characters and instead transforms into something closer to myth-making itself. The film subtly reveals that what we call legendary figures are actually emotional constructions built over time, shaped by how stories are remembered, retold, and emotionally interpreted by future generations. Mufasa is no longer just a character inside a story, he becomes a symbol that evolves depending on who is observing him. The most interesting psychological idea at this level is that identity is not fixed at all. It is constantly rewritten through memory. The film shows Mufasa's journey in such a detailed emotional way that it retroactively changes how the audience perceives his future self in the original mythology. This creates a layered experience where past, present, and future versions of the same character all coexist in the viewer's mind. This is not just storytelling, it is emotional reconstruction. At a deeper level, the film explores something very close to Jungian psychology, the idea of archetypes forming through emotional repetition. Mufasa becomes the archetype of the responsible protector king, but that archetype is not natural, it is built through repeated suffering, choices, and sacrifices. Taka, on the other hand, becomes the archetype of the broken reflection, the emotional shadow that represents what could happen if pain is not processed properly. Together, they form two halves of the same emotional spectrum. What makes this even more powerful is that the film never treats these outcomes as destiny. Instead, it suggests that these identities are formed through accumulation. A single emotional wound does not define a person, but repeated emotional patterns do. Over time, these patterns become personality. Personality becomes behavior. Behavior becomes identity. And identity eventually becomes legend. This chain is what the film quietly explores from beginning to end. Another major layer in this final interpretation is the concept of emotional inheritance. The film suggests that future generations do not just inherit titles or kingdoms, they inherit emotional consequences. The legacy of Mufasa is not only his leadership, but also the emotional structure he leaves behind. The way he chooses to act in moments of pressure creates a blueprint for how others will interpret leadership after him. In this sense, leadership is not just personal, it is generational. The film also subtly raises an uncomfortable truth, that greatness often isolates the individual who achieves it. Mufasa becomes more emotionally distant from ordinary connection as he grows into responsibility. This is not portrayed as pride, but as consequence. Leadership demands emotional distance, not because leaders stop caring, but because they must carry burdens others cannot fully share. This emotional isolation is one of the quiet tragedies embedded in the story. Taka's emotional arc, when viewed at this level, represents the opposite trajectory. While Mufasa expands into responsibility, Taka contracts into emotional self-protection. This contraction is not immediate or dramatic, it is gradual, almost invisible. The film suggests that emotional pain does not always explode outward, sometimes it folds inward until it becomes identity itself. This inward collapse is what ultimately defines his path. The symbolic meaning of the Pride Lands also becomes clearer in this final layer. The land itself is not just geography, it is emotional memory made physical. As the characters move through it, they are not only interacting with nature but also with their internal emotional states. Open plains represent clarity and acceptance, while harsh environments represent emotional conflict and unresolved tension. The world becomes a mirror of psychological truth. The film's ending, when interpreted at this level, is not an endpoint at all. It is a transition point. It shows that stories do not end, they transform into memory, and memory transforms into identity. Mufasa's final state is therefore not completion, but integration. All emotional experiences he has endured are now fully part of who he is. Nothing is wasted, nothing is erased. This is why the story feels so emotionally persistent even after it ends. It does not close itself off. Instead, it leaves emotional patterns active in the viewer's mind. The audience continues to process the meaning long after the film is over because the narrative structure is designed like emotional residue rather than a closed story. Ultimately, the deepest message of Mufasa, the Lion King, is that identity is not something we discover, it is something we continuously build through emotional experience. Every choice, every reaction, every moment of fear or compassion contributes to the architecture of who we become. Some people build through openness, others through defense, but all identities are shaped through emotional repetition over time. And in that sense, Mufasa is not just a king in a story. He is a reflection of what it means to carry emotional responsibility in a world that constantly tests the boundaries of patience, compassion, and endurance. His legend is not created by destiny, it is created by endurance through suffering, and the decision to remain morally grounded even when everything around him changes. The story of Mufasa, the Lion King, does not begin with power, glory, or destiny already fulfilled. Instead, it begins in silence, the kind of silence that exists before a storm shapes a world. Before Mufasa becomes a symbol of leadership, before his name carries weight across the Pride Lands, he exists as something far more fragile, a life trying to understand its place in a world that does not immediately recognize him. And it is within this fragile beginning that the emotional foundation of the entire story is built. What makes this origin deeply compelling is that Mufasa is not introduced as special. He is not born into greatness in the traditional sense, nor is he immediately surrounded by admiration or certainty. Instead, he is shaped by uncertainty. His early existence is defined by vulnerability, displacement, and emotional searching. This is crucial because the film does not allow greatness to appear instantly. It insists that greatness must be constructed slowly, through experience, pressure, and emotional endurance. In these early moments, the world itself feels vast and indifferent. The landscapes of the Pride Lands are not yet home, they are territory, unknown and unpredictable. Nature is not romanticized as comforting, instead, it feels like a force that must be understood, respected, and survived. This environmental framing is important because it mirrors Mufasa's internal state. Just as the world around him is unfamiliar, so too is his understanding of himself. At this stage, survival is not just physical, it is emotional. Every interaction carries weight because identity has not yet been formed. Who Mufasa is, what he will become, and where he belongs are all unanswered questions. And the film uses this uncertainty to create emotional realism. It is not presenting a destined king, it is presenting a being in formation. What is most interesting is how the film subtly establishes the idea that identity is not something discovered, but something constructed through repeated emotional experiences. Mufasa does not find himself in a single moment. Instead, he slowly accumulates meaning through interactions, decisions, and emotional responses. Each experience adds another layer to his developing sense of self. This is why even early struggles matter so much, they are not just events, they are building blocks of personality. As the narrative begins to unfold, we also begin to understand that Mufasa's emotional core is defined not by aggression or dominance, but by observation and empathy. He does not immediately react to the world with force. Instead, he studies it, adapts to it, and slowly learns how to exist within it. This emotional sensitivity becomes one of his defining traits, and it will later become the foundation of his leadership. However, at this early stage, sensitivity is not yet strength. It is uncertainty. And the film carefully balances this by showing that vulnerability and potential often exist in the same space. Mufasa is not yet who he will become, but he is already being shaped by forces he does not fully understand. This is also where the emotional tone of the entire story begins to form. The film does not rush toward action or conflict. Instead, it builds atmosphere, emotional atmosphere. Silence becomes meaningful. Space becomes expressive. Even still moments carry psychological weight. The viewer is not just watching events, they are absorbing emotional transitions. And in this slow construction of identity, the film plants its most important idea, that greatness is not a starting point, it is a consequence. A consequence of endurance, emotional interpretation, and repeated internal transformation. As the journey continues, the world around Mufasa begins to take shape not as a destination, but as a testing ground. In Mufasa, the Lion King, the environment is never just background, it is an active force that shapes emotion, behavior, and identity. In these early stages, survival is not heroic or glorified. It is quiet, uncertain, and often emotionally exhausting. Mufasa's early experiences are defined by adaptation. He is not yet a leader, nor even a follower in a structured sense. He is simply a presence moving through a world that does not adjust itself for him. Every step forward carries uncertainty. Every interaction carries the possibility of rejection or acceptance. And it is in this emotional instability that the foundation of resilience begins to form. What is important in this phase is that survival is not portrayed as instinct alone. The film subtly shows that survival also requires emotional interpretation. Two individuals can face the same situation and experience it completely differently depending on how they process fear, trust, and expectation. Mufasa begins to develop a pattern where fear does not immediately translate into paralysis. Instead, fear becomes information. This transformation is the first sign of emotional intelligence forming beneath the surface. At the same time, the world does not treat him gently. There is no sense of privilege or protection. Instead, there is resistance. Not necessarily in the form of direct conflict at first, but in the form of indifference. The world does not acknowledge potential, it only responds to action. This forces Mufasa into a state of continuous emotional learning. He must constantly adjust, reassess, and respond. This is also where the film begins to establish one of its most important psychological themes: identity is shaped in response to pressure, not comfort. Without pressure, there is no transformation. Without uncertainty, there is no growth. Mufasa's early journey is not about success, it is about adaptation under emotional weight. During this phase, subtle emotional patterns begin to form. Mufasa starts to show a natural tendency toward protection, even when he has nothing to gain from it. This is not yet leadership, it is instinctive empathy. He reacts to vulnerability in others not with calculation, but with emotional alignment. He recognizes suffering not as something external, but something he can understand internally. This ability becomes crucial later in his transformation, but here it is still unrefined. It is not yet controlled or strategic. It is simply human-like emotional response in a world that often rewards detachment. And this contrast creates tension. The more emotionally aware he becomes, the more he begins to stand apart from the emotional environment around him. The film carefully avoids rushing this development. Instead, it allows small moments to accumulate meaning. A hesitation before a decision. A pause during uncertainty. A silent observation of consequences. These are not dramatic events, but they are psychologically significant. They show that identity is being shaped not through grand events, but through repeated micro-responses to life. Meanwhile, the environment continues to reflect this internal instability. The world is vast, unpredictable, and emotionally neutral. It does not guide Mufasa, it simply exists. This neutrality forces him to assign meaning to experiences himself. And this act of interpretation becomes one of the most important aspects of his psychological development. The film also subtly introduces the idea that isolation is not only physical, it is emotional. Even when surrounded by life, Mufasa often exists in a state of internal separation. He is observing, learning, and adapting, but not yet fully connected to any stable emotional structure. This emotional isolation is not portrayed as suffering alone, it is portrayed as a necessary stage of formation. Because of this, early survival begins to transform into something deeper, awareness. And awareness is the first step toward leadership, even if leadership is still far in the future. What the film is really building in this section is not a story of action, but a psychological blueprint. It is showing how a being begins to interpret the world before it begins to change it. Mufasa is not shaping the world, yet the world is shaping him. And in that shaping process, the first emotional footprint of his eventual identity is created. As the journey deepens, the emotional landscape of Mufasa, the Lion King, begins to shift from individual survival into relational psychology. This is the stage where identity is no longer shaped in isolation, but through comparison, connection, and emotional mirroring. It is here that Taka enters the narrative space not merely as another character, but as the first emotional mirror through which Mufasa's identity begins to reflect back at itself in a more complex form. The introduction of Taka is not simply the arrival of a companion, it is the arrival of contrast. Where Mufasa carries emotional openness, adaptability, and instinctive empathy, Taka carries sensitivity shaped by insecurity, expectation, and the need for recognition. This difference is not immediately presented as conflict, but as complement. At first, their bond appears natural, almost inevitable, as if two different emotional frequencies have temporarily aligned within the same space. In these early interactions, brotherhood is not defined by dominance or hierarchy. Instead, it is defined by shared experience. Both characters are still forming their understanding of the world, and this shared uncertainty creates a fragile but meaningful connection. They explore, observe, and react together, and in doing so, they begin to construct a shared emotional vocabulary. This vocabulary is not spoken in words, it is expressed through trust, hesitation, curiosity, and reaction. However, what makes this relationship psychologically significant is not what is shared, but how it is interpreted differently. Mufasa experiences connection as expansion. Every interaction strengthens his understanding of the world and his place within it. Taka, on the other hand, begins to experience connection through comparison. He starts measuring his emotional worth against Mufasa's responses, even when no competition is explicitly present. This is where the film introduces one of its most important psychological tensions: emotional interpretation creates emotional reality. Two individuals can live the same moment, but the meaning they extract from it determines how that moment shapes their identity. For Mufasa, shared experience builds trust. For Taka, it slowly introduces doubt. The early bond between them is still genuine. There is warmth, curiosity, and a sense of companionship that feels natural rather than forced. But beneath this surface, subtle emotional patterns begin to form. Mufasa often responds instinctively to situations with calm action or protective behavior, while Taka increasingly responds with observation and internal processing. This difference may seem small, but it becomes foundational over time. The film carefully avoids presenting Taka as immediately insecure or antagonistic. Instead, it shows how insecurity develops gradually through repeated emotional interpretation. A moment where Mufasa is naturally recognized for bravery. A situation where attention shifts toward him without intention. A reaction from others that feels slightly imbalanced. None of these moments are dramatic on their own, but together they begin to shape Taka's internal emotional framework. This is the quiet construction of emotional imbalance. It does not happen through betrayal. It happens through perception. At the same time, Mufasa remains largely unaware of this internal shift. His emotional focus is outward, directed toward understanding the world rather than analyzing social positioning. This lack of self-conscious comparison is what allows him to remain emotionally stable, but it also means he does not immediately recognize the emotional changes occurring in Taka. And this gap in awareness becomes important later. The environment continues to play a symbolic role in this stage of the story. Open landscapes often accompany moments of connection, suggesting emotional freedom and shared possibility. But as subtle emotional tension begins to form, even these open spaces begin to feel slightly divided in framing. The film uses composition to suggest emotional distance long before it becomes narrative conflict. Another important layer in this section is the emergence of emotional dependency patterns. Taka begins to rely, without fully realizing it, on external emotional validation to stabilize his sense of self. Mufasa's presence becomes both comforting and destabilizing, comforting because of companionship, and destabilizing because of comparison. This duality creates internal conflict that is not yet visible externally. Meanwhile, Mufasa continues to evolve through experience rather than reflection. His growth is action-based. He learns by responding to situations, not by analyzing his identity within them. This creates a natural divergence between the two characters, one is becoming defined by action, the other by interpretation. The film does something subtle but powerful here. It establishes that neither path is inherently wrong, but both lead to different emotional outcomes. One leads toward stability through external engagement, the other risks instability through internal comparison. This is not moral judgment, it is psychological observation. As the bond between them deepens, so does its complexity. Brotherhood is no longer just companionship, it becomes a system of emotional feedback. Every action begins to carry interpretive weight. Every success, every failure, every moment of attention or lack thereof begins to shape internal emotional narratives. And this is where the first true seeds of divergence are planted. Not conflict. Not betrayal. But interpretation. Because in the world of Mufasa, the Lion King, the most powerful force is not action, it is meaning assigned to action. As the narrative of Mufasa, the Lion King continues to unfold, the emotional tone begins to subtly change. What once felt like a stable and natural brotherhood now starts to develop invisible fractures. These fractures are not loud or dramatic at first. They do not announce themselves as conflict. Instead, they exist as small emotional distortions, moments that seem insignificant individually but begin to accumulate psychological weight over time. At this stage, Mufasa continues to evolve through action. His responses to the world remain instinctive, grounded, and outward focused. He does not consciously seek recognition or validation. When challenges arise, he reacts not with calculation but with presence. This creates an impression of reliability in the environment around him. Others begin to respond to him naturally, not because he demands attention, but because his actions consistently align with protection, stability, and calm decision-making under pressure. However, this natural development becomes the silent pressure point in his relationship with Taka. Taka's emotional world begins to shift in ways that are not immediately visible externally. Unlike Mufasa, who processes experience through action, Taka processes experience through reflection. And in this reflection, comparison begins to take root. Every situation that results in Mufasa being noticed, appreciated, or followed creates an internal emotional echo in Taka's mind. Not because attention is taken away from him directly, but because he begins to interpret shared experiences through a lens of imbalance. This is where the psychological depth of Mufasa, the Lion King, becomes more pronounced. The film does not present jealousy as a sudden transformation. Instead, it presents it as a slow restructuring of perception. Taka does not become insecure in a single moment. He becomes insecure through repetition, through patterns that his mind begins to recognize and reinterpret over time. A key psychological shift begins to occur. Experience is no longer neutral for Taka. It becomes comparative. Where Mufasa sees events as challenges to be navigated, Taka begins to see them as indicators of relative worth. This difference in interpretation marks the beginning of emotional divergence between the two characters. What makes this stage particularly tragic is that Mufasa remains largely unaware of this internal shift. His focus continues to be external on survival, adaptation, and understanding the world around him. He does not yet possess the emotional framework to recognize that relationships can change even when intentions remain pure. This lack of awareness is not presented as flaw, but as innocence. The world around them also begins to subtly respond to Mufasa's natural leadership qualities. Situations naturally place him in positions where decisions must be made quickly. His calmness in uncertainty creates a sense of stability that others instinctively rely on. This is not a title he claims, it is a role that emerges through repetition of behavior. But this emergent leadership creates an unintended emotional imbalance in the Brotherhood. Taka begins to experience what can be described as emotional displacement without exclusion. He is not pushed away, rejected, or ignored in any direct sense. Instead, he begins to feel that his emotional presence is becoming less significant in comparison to Mufasa's growing influence. This feeling is subtle but persistent. It does not need external validation to exist, it grows internally through interpretation. The film carefully emphasizes that this is not a conflict caused by action, but by emotional framing. Two individuals can share the same space, the same experiences, and the same challenges, but still arrive at completely different emotional conclusions. This is one of the central psychological ideas of the story. Reality is not what happens, but how it is emotionally interpreted. As these internal shifts continue, the bond between Mufasa and Taka does not break, it tightens in complexity. On the surface, they remain connected. They still share moments of cooperation, understanding, and familiarity. But beneath this surface, emotional symmetry begins to fade. One is expanding into confidence through action, while the other is folding inward into self-evaluation through comparison. The environment continues to reinforce this emotional divide in subtle ways. Open spaces that once felt shared now begin to feel emotionally directional, often framing Mufasa as the point of focus even when he is not consciously seeking it. These visual patterns are not accidental, they reflect the growing psychological reality of the characters. At this point in the story, the most important transformation is not external. It is internal, the shift from shared experience to interpreted inequality. This shift marks the first true fracture in their emotional connection. Taka does not yet act against Mufasa. There is no hostility, no betrayal, no visible conflict. But something far more important has changed. His internal emotional language has begun to separate from Mufasa's. Where there was once shared meaning, there is now divergent interpretation. And once interpretation diverges, emotional unity begins to weaken, even if physical presence remains unchanged. This is the silent tragedy at the heart of the stage of Mufasa, the Lion King. Not loss. Not separation. But the beginning of misunderstanding. As the story of Mufasa, the Lion King progresses further, the emotional structure of the Brotherhood reaches a critical transition point. What was once a shared journey between two developing identities now begins to split into two entirely different psychological trajectories. The shift is not loud or dramatic, it is gradual, almost imperceptible, but its consequences are irreversible. Mufasa, without consciously seeking it, begins to step into a role that can only be described as emergent leadership. This is not leadership defined by authority or title, but by consistent behavioral response under uncertainty. In situations where others hesitate, Mufasa acts. In moments of confusion, he stabilizes. In environments of unpredictability, he becomes the reference point. This pattern repeats itself so naturally that it does not feel like promotion, it feels like necessity. What is crucial here is that Mufasa does not interpret this shift as identity elevation. He does not see himself as becoming something greater. Instead, he continues to function in the same way he always has, responding, adapting, and protecting. but the world around him begins to reorganize itself around his consistency. This is how leadership forms in the natural world of the story, not through ambition, but through repetition of reliable emotional and physical presence. However, this natural gravitational shift creates emotional consequences in Taka that become increasingly difficult to contain internally. Taka does not experience Mufasa's rising role as neutral. He experiences it as a gradual repositioning of emotional significance. The key issue is not that Mufasa is changing, but that the emotional hierarchy between them is being rewritten without explicit acknowledgement. This creates a psychological tension that is difficult to articulate, even internally. Taka is not being excluded, but he is beginning to feel less central in situations where he once felt equally relevant. This feeling does not manifest as immediate anger. Instead, it manifests as internal questioning. Why is attention shifting? Why are decisions increasingly influenced by Mufasa's instincts? Why does it feel like outcomes naturally align around him? These questions do not have clear answers, which makes them more emotionally unstable. Unanswered emotional questions tend to evolve into internal narratives, and in Taka's case, those narratives slowly begin to distort perception. This is where the psychological depth of Mufasa, the Lion King, becomes especially significant. The film shows that emotional breakdown is rarely caused by a single event. Instead, it is caused by the accumulation of interpreted meaning. Taka does not break because of what happens around him, he begins to change because of how he repeatedly interprets what happens around him. Meanwhile, Mufasa remains largely unaware of this internal transformation. His focus is still external, directed toward immediate survival and situational stability. He does not analyze emotional hierarchy or relational positioning. This creates a widening gap between external reality and internal perception within the Brotherhood. To Mufasa, nothing fundamental has changed. To Taka, everything is gradually shifting. This divergence creates one of the most important emotional dynamics in the entire film: asymmetric awareness. One character adapts to the world as it is. The other adapts to the world as it feels. And these two versions of reality begin to drift apart. At this stage, Mufasa's leadership becomes more visible to others around him. Not because he claims it, but because his decisions consistently produce stability in uncertain situations. This reinforces the external perception that he is becoming the natural center of decision-making. But this external reinforcement deepens the internal emotional contrast in Taka, who begins to feel increasingly disconnected from that center. Importantly, the film does not portray Taka as irrational. His emotional responses are grounded in understandable psychological processes: comparison, perceived imbalance, and the need for recognition within shared experience. The tragedy lies not in emotional weakness, but in emotional accumulation without expression. Nothing is spoken early enough to prevent interpretation from hardening into belief. As this stage develops, even shared moments begin to carry different emotional meanings. A successful outcome for both becomes a reinforcing moment for Mufasa, but a reflective moment for Taka. A shared achievement becomes unity on the surface but separation in interpretation underneath. This dual-layer emotional reading is what slowly destabilizes the bond. The environment continues to mirror this shift subtly. Spaces that once felt shared now feel narratively centered around action rather than connection. The framing of events increasingly positions Mufasa as the focal point of resolution, reinforcing the emotional narrative of emergence. This does not diminish Taka physically, but it contributes to his sense of gradual emotional displacement. What makes this phase especially important is that nothing has fully broken yet. There is no confrontation, no betrayal, no visible rupture. And yet, the emotional structure of the relationship has already changed irreversibly. The bond still exists, but it no longer operates on the same psychological frequency. This is the hidden truth of the stage of Mufasa, the Lion King. Not all breakage is visible. Some of it happens internally, long before it becomes external reality. And once perception changes, Reality follows slowly behind it. At the stage of Mufasa, the Lion King, the story enters a psychological threshold where nothing external seems dramatically different, yet internally everything has already begun to change shape permanently. This is the phase where emotional structures stop being flexible and start becoming fixed. What was once interpretation now begins to harden into belief, and belief slowly starts guiding behavior. Mufasa continues to evolve in a direction that feels increasingly natural to others around him. His decisions carry weight not because he demands authority, but because outcomes repeatedly validate his instincts. In uncertain situations, he becomes the point of emotional stabilization. Others may hesitate, but his responses create clarity. This repeated pattern gradually reinforces his position as a natural center of decision-making within their shared environment. However, the most important aspect of this transformation is that Mufasa does not consciously register it as transformation. To him, nothing fundamental has changed about who he is. He is still reacting, still adapting, still trying to understand the world as it unfolds. This lack of self-referential awareness becomes a defining trait he grows without observing his own growth. Meanwhile, Taka reaches a deeper emotional threshold. What once existed as subtle comparison has now begun to evolve into structured internal narrative. He no longer just feels difference, he begins to explain it to himself. This is the critical psychological shift, when emotion turns into interpretation, and interpretation becomes identity reinforcement. At this point, Taka's emotional world is no longer reactive. It is reconstructive. He starts revisiting past experiences through a revised lens, re-evaluating moments that once felt neutral and assigning them new meaning. A situation that once felt like shared success now feels like unnoticed displacement. A moment of Mufasa's natural leadership now feels like emotional overshadowing. Nothing external has changed, but everything internal has been reweighted. This is one of the most important psychological mechanisms explored in Mufasa, the Lion King. Memory is not static, it is rewritten by emotional state. Taka's past is no longer a fixed record of events. It becomes a shifting narrative that supports his current emotional condition. And once memory becomes narrative, perception becomes irreversible. The emotional distance between the two characters begins to manifest in subtle behavioral changes. Conversations carry less spontaneity. Responses become more measured. Moments that once flowed naturally now contain hesitation, even when nothing explicit is being said. The bond still exists on the surface, but its emotional rhythm is no longer synchronized. Mufasa senses none of this consciously. His focus remains outward, directed toward maintaining stability in the environment around him. But emotionally, something begins to feel different, even if he cannot define it. This is the beginning of unconscious awareness, of feeling that something in the relationship has shifted, without clarity on what or why. Taka, on the other hand, becomes increasingly self-contained. His emotional processing moves inward rather than outward. Instead of expressing confusion or insecurity, he begins to internalize it. This internalization is not immediate rebellion, it is emotional compression. And emotional compression always carries long-term consequences, because unspoken emotion does not disappear, it accumulates. The film carefully avoids presenting this moment as a dramatic rupture. There is no single event that defines the turning point. Instead, it presents a sequence of micro-shifts, slightly delayed responses, reduced emotional openness, subtle changes in tone, and quiet re-evaluation of shared experiences. These are small signals, but together they form a clear psychological transition. At this stage, leadership and emotional hierarchy begin to separate. Mufasa's leadership is external, it is recognized through action and outcome. Taka's experience is internal, it is defined through interpretation and emotional resonance. This separation creates a fundamental imbalance in how each character understands the same reality. One of the most important realizations emerging here is that connection does not fail because of absence, it fails because of misalignment in meaning. The brotherhood is still physically intact, but emotionally it is beginning to operate on two different frequencies. What one interprets as natural progression, the other interprets as gradual displacement. This divergence is where silent resentment begins to form. Not as anger, not as hostility, but as emotional distance that is not yet spoken aloud. It exists in pauses, in unspoken thoughts, and in moments where emotional expression would have once occurred but no longer does. By the end of the stage, the relationship has not yet collapsed, but it has crossed a threshold that cannot be reversed through simple communication. The emotional architecture has already shifted. Even if words were spoken now, they would be interpreted through altered emotional frameworks. And that is the most important realization of this part of Mufasa, the Lion King. Some changes do not announce themselves. They simply become the new normal, until one day, everything feels different without anyone remembering the exact moment it changed. By the stage of Mufasa, the Lion King, the emotional structure of the story enters its most psychologically unstable phase so far. Nothing external appears fully broken yet, but internally, the foundation of the brotherhood has already begun to fracture beyond repair. This is the point where emotion stops being fluid and starts becoming identity. Taka's internal world is no longer simply reactive, it is now interpretive in a way that reshapes his entire understanding of reality. What began as subtle comparison has now evolved into a persistent emotional framework. Every action, every outcome, every moment shared with Mufasa is now filtered through a single underlying question: what does this say about me in comparison to him? This shift may seem small, but psychologically it is enormous, because it means experience is no longer lived directly, it is constantly evaluated. In this new internal structure, Taka begins to experience what can be described as emotional duality. On the surface, he still participates in shared experiences, still engages in conversation, still exists within the same physical space as Mufasa. But internally, there is now a second layer running parallel to reality. One layer experiences events as they are happening. The other layer immediately reinterprets those same events in terms of emotional positioning. This split creates internal tension that is no longer visible to others, but deeply active within him. The film uses this psychological shift to show how resentment is not created in a single moment, it is constructed gradually through repeated emotional reinterpretation. Taka does not suddenly decide to feel differently. Instead, he begins to accumulate emotional weight from moments that were never fully expressed or resolved. Each unspoken feeling adds pressure to his internal world, and over time, that pressure begins to change how he perceives even neutral events. Mufasa, meanwhile, continues on a trajectory that remains outward-facing and action-driven. His leadership presence becomes even more natural, not through effort but through consistency. Others around him respond to his clarity in moments of uncertainty, reinforcing his role without formal recognition. However, this increasing reliance on him also deepens the emotional distance between him and Taka, because Mufasa does not interpret these shifts as relational changes, he interprets them as situational necessity. This difference in interpretation is critical. Mufasa sees the world in terms of action and response. Taka sees it in terms of meaning and emotional implication. And as these two interpretive systems drift further apart, shared experience becomes less shared in emotional reality, even though it remains shared physically. At this point, resentment begins to take shape not as hostility, but as emotional accumulation without release. Taka does not express his internal conflict outwardly in a direct way. Instead, it begins to manifest in subtle emotional distancing. Moments of connection become less spontaneous. Responses become slightly more guarded. Emotional openness begins to contract. The most important transformation happening here is internal fragmentation. Taka no longer holds a single unified emotional identity. Instead, two versions of himself begin to emerge. One version still values the bond with Mufasa, still remembers shared experience with emotional attachment. The other version begins to question the fairness of that bond, reinterpreting past and present through a lens of imbalance. These two internal voices do not fully separate yet, but they begin to compete for dominance. This internal conflict creates emotional instability, because neither version can fully silence the other. One represents memory and attachment. The other represents interpretation and perceived injustice. The tension between them becomes exhausting, even if it remains invisible externally. The world around them does not resolve this tension. In fact, it unintentionally reinforces it. Situations continue to arise where Mufasa's instincts lead to effective outcomes, further strengthening external trust in him. Each of these moments becomes emotionally neutral for Mufasa, but emotionally loaded for Taka. The same event creates two entirely different emotional consequences depending on perspective. This is where Mufasa, the Lion King, deepens its psychological core. Reality is not the source of emotional pain, interpretation is. As Taka's internal narrative strengthens, he begins to unconsciously rewrite the emotional meaning of past experiences. Moments that were once shared joy begin to feel like early signs of displacement. Neutral events begin to feel like patterns of exclusion. This reinterpretation is not intentional, it is a psychological adaptation to unresolved emotional pressure. Meanwhile, Mufasa remains unaware that anything fundamental has changed. He continues to function within the same emotional framework he has always used: respond, adapt, protect. Because he does not analyze relational hierarchy, he does not perceive the shift occurring beneath the surface. This asymmetry in awareness becomes one of the most important emotional imbalances in the entire story. The bond between them has not yet broken, but it has stopped evolving in the same direction. Instead of growing together, they are now diverging inwardly. One is expanding through responsibility. The other is contracting through interpretation. And between these two movements, distance quietly forms. By the end of this stage, the emotional structure of the relationship is no longer stable. It still exists, but it is no longer supported by shared interpretation. And once meaning diverges, connection becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. This is the quiet psychological turning point of Mufasa, the Lion King. Not the moment things fall apart, but the moment they stop being understood the same way. At this stage of Mufasa, the Lion King, the story enters a phase where the emotional distance between Mufasa and Taka is no longer subtle or internal. It begins to manifest in visible shifts in behavior, tone, and presence. What was once an invisible psychological divergence now starts to surface in the physical world, although still not in the form of open conflict. Instead, it appears as tension that neither side fully acknowledges, yet both can increasingly feel. Mufasa continues to operate within his established pattern of action-based understanding. He responds to challenges with clarity, adapts to instability with calmness, and naturally becomes the anchor in situations where others feel uncertainty. His leadership is no longer emerging, it is now established through repetition. Others look to him not because he demands it, but because his presence consistently produces stability. This reinforces his identity externally, solidifying the role he has unconsciously stepped into. However, what is becoming increasingly important is that Mufasa still does not recognize this transformation internally. He does not view himself as separate from others in status or emotional position. His perception remains grounded in immediate reality rather than relational hierarchy. This creates a widening gap between how he sees himself and how he is being perceived by the world around him. Taka, on the other hand, has now reached a critical psychological threshold. The internal split that began earlier has now intensified into emotional fragmentation. The two internal narratives, one rooted in emotional attachment and shared history, the other rooted in interpretation and perceived imbalance, are no longer balanced. The interpretive narrative is beginning to dominate. This shift changes everything. At this point, Taka no longer experiences events as neutral occurrences that can be emotionally processed later. Instead, he begins to experience them as confirmation of a belief system that has been gradually forming inside him. Every action taken by Mufasa, no matter how neutral or unintentional, is now filtered through a framework of meaning that reinforces emotional distance. This is no longer interpretation in a flexible sense, it is interpretation becoming structure. The film shows that once perception reaches this stage, reality itself becomes secondary. What matters is no longer what is happening, but what it is believed to mean. This is the psychological turning point where emotional distortion begins to feel like truth to the person experiencing it. Taka's emotional world begins to harden into certainty. Uncertainty, which once allowed space for doubt or reconsideration, now begins to disappear. In its place, a fixed narrative emerges. This narrative is not built on a single moment but on accumulation, hundreds of small emotional reinterpretations that have slowly formed into a stable belief about identity, fairness, and emotional positioning. As this internal structure solidifies, his behavior begins to change in subtle but noticeable ways.